So Apple did something recently that I totally wasn't expecting, and that is that they put out the iPhone SE back out on their store. Now, this wasn't on their main store, this was actually on their clearance store. And although at first I didn't think there was much fanfare, you could get a pretty decently priced iPhone for $250 or $300 for a 128GB model. Aside from the initial shock of Apple bringing back a product they no longer sell in their store, which makes sense, maybe they found some older units in the back and hey, we have a bunch of iPhone SEs that we never sold, let's go out and sell them. The next thing that happened was what surprised me the most, and that was that the iPhone SE kind of sold out immediately. And this kind of happened in two different rounds. So when the iPhone SE was first put on the Apple website, it sold out, okay? And then some more 32GB models came back in stock, and all of a sudden, if you go back on the website, if you go back to that clearance website, those models are also sold out now as well. And with this recent sellout of the iPhone SE and with Apple's problems with iPhone sales recently, it got me to thinking that Apple needs to bring back the iPhone SE. So let's go ahead and explore this, why Apple needs to bring back the iPhone SE. So let's give some backstory on the iPhone SE first. So when Apple first announced this, they announced it a little bit after they announced their flagship phones, the iPhone 6s and iPhone 6s Plus. Their initial reason for bringing back the iPhone SE was because their fans were asking them for a phone in a smaller form factor. They wanted that classic 4-inch iPhone that you can hold in one hand, take your finger from any point of the screen and go from the top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. They wanted a phone you can hold in one hand and control very easily. At least that's what the Apple marketing around the time told us, is that people wanted a smaller iPhone and they were clamoring and asking for Apple to bring it back, so Apple brought back a smaller formed iPhone. And the genius part about the iPhone SE is that it took the most important parts of the iPhone 6s and iPhone 6s Plus and brought them into the smaller formed iPhone. So it brought in important specs like the A9 chip, which was the modern iPhone chip at the time, and more importantly, it brought in the same exact flagship camera that was found in the iPhone 6s. So even though it still had that small inch iPhone 5s design, it had modern specs inside of it. And sure, it made some concessions. It still didn't have the best front-facing camera, and I still believe it had the first generation of Touch ID, but it was a very, very solid phone. In fact, the phone was so solid that at the time I owned an iPhone 6 Plus, and I didn't get an iPhone 6s or an iPhone 6s Plus, but I was really wanting a modern smartphone at the time with modern specs inside of it, and I kind of missed the 4-inch form factor of going to the iPhone 6 Plus. I wanted something smaller in my pocket. So at the time, I spent $400 to get the iPhone SE, and I really, really enjoyed it for the time I used it. I really loved the performance of that A9 chip at the time, and everything ran really smoothly on the iPhone SE. I loved having that camera, and what was really cool about the iPhone SE is that it didn't have a camera bump compared to the 6s and the 6s Plus, so there was kind of a little benefit of going back to that older iPhone 5s design. And more importantly, I love the form factor and I love the size. I loved how easy it was to fit the iPhone SE inside of my pocket, and I loved holding that phone in my one hand. Even though it was a small 4-inch screen and it did take some getting used to, I really loved the compact size of that phone. Being able to take a phone and hold it in one hand and reach any part of the screen is seriously undervalued, especially in today's market where the phones seem to be getting bigger and bigger. And don't get me wrong, I love my iPhone XS Max. I love the giant screen it has, and I even like the iPhone XR, which has a really nice compromise between the size of the iPhone X and the iPhone XS Max. But I could definitely see the need of going back to the smaller form factor of iPhones, or more importantly, finding an iPhone that fits into a budget model but still has really decent specs inside of it. And if they bring back the iPhone SE too, I think there's two routes that Apple could go with here. So let's explore both of those routes. And this first route has everything to do with how the iPhone SE was first released. Even though there's only been one iPhone SE to date, the historical context of that phone was bringing back an older design and putting in a modern chipset and a modern camera inside of it. With that being said, maybe we could see an iPhone SE that adopts the iPhone 8 design. So it would have the same exact body as the iPhone 8. Maybe they can make some cost-saving measures somewhere along the design. But basically that 4.7-inch form factor that Apple is now getting rid of with the iPhone XR and the iPhone XS. So although it would have that same older design as the iPhone 6, iPhone 7, iPhone 8, you could still put things in it that would improve the smartphone. So for example, you could put in that A12 chip inside of it, make sure it's running the latest and greatest Apple hardware. You could keep the 3 gigabytes of RAM. Maybe you could do some cost-cutting measures. So I don't know if it would include wireless charging, but maybe getting rid of the glass back, maybe going back to an aluminum style like the iPhone 6 and iPhone 7, you could save some money there and get the components cost down. So if an iPhone SE2 was released without a glass back, with back to the old aluminum style framing, we're going back to a classic design here. And as long as it had important things like the A12 chip inside of it and putting in the same exact camera that is found on the iPhone XR, with all the inclusions of features like Smart HDR, you could have a really, really compelling phone that a lot of people might want to buy. Obviously, because it's an older iPhone design, you wouldn't include things like Face ID. You would go back to the Touch ID sensor as found on the iPhone 6, 7, and 8. And I just think this would be a more comfortable design for people who are looking for a budget option. It would be a phone that is comfortable for people who like the older designs of iPhones, and you could price it a lot lower by getting rid of some of those features I mentioned. So if Apple did an iPhone SE to retake, we could expect it to see a similar form factor design as an iPhone 6, and kind of pack in all those extra things like the A12 chip and better camera. And hopefully Apple could get that priced around $400, maybe $450. And I think this would just be a really compelling phone for a lot of people, especially people who are really price sensitive or people who don't like the newer designs of the iPhone XR and XS series. Okay, let's talk about the second route that Apple might go. And this is the more radical route. And let's just call this the iPhone SE 10. And this design would be an iPhone SE with the same exact 4-inch body size as the old iPhone SE, except the screen would go from the top to bottom like the iPhone X design phones. So although the screen of this phone would be bigger than the 4 inches that was found on the iPhone SE, it would still have the same general footprint as that phone. So you wouldn't really increase the body size too much. You would just be stretching the screen to the outmost edges of the phone. And I think ideally this would be a 4.7 to 5-inch screen size. You can also use the same exact screen technology that is found in the iPhone XR to make it an LCD panel that still manages to go edge to edge with slightly thicker bezels than the iPhone XS, but you would still get an LCD panel, which should cut down on cost quite a lot. Now, because the screen does go edge to edge, you wouldn't have room to put a Touch ID sensor inside of it, so the iPhone SE 10 would have to include things like Face ID. However, I think my argument still holds true that maybe you could get rid of things like wireless charging in the iPhone SE, maybe keep that a feature for the flagship phones, and again, that should save down on cost a little bit. But the most important things that Apple has to include in this iPhone SE 10 is a modern chipset inside of it. So you would have to include that A12 chip, the same one that's found on the iPhone XR and the iPhone XS, and you would also have to include the same great camera, that single lens system that is found on the iPhone XR. Because what made the original iPhone SE so great is that it was a modern chipset inside of that phone. There weren't really any compromises on performance, just compromises on screen size. And honestly, by going to a 4.7 to 5-inch screen, by keeping it the same exact body as an iPhone SE, but enlarging that screen size, I think that could be a compelling phone for a lot of people. And even though in recent years I've been trending towards bigger phones, if you packed a screen size big enough in a smaller form factor, I could almost see myself switching back to that style of phone because I really do like the way smaller phones fit in your pocket. I really like how they feel in your hand. And if you make a screen that's big enough for me, something that isn't so puny and small like a 4-inch phone, and you put a good typing experience on it, I could definitely see that being compelling to a lot of people who like the iPhone 5S design, and I could see it being compelling even to me as someone who usually buys a flagship style phone. So you'd be following the iPhone X design, and even though it is an iPhone SE, this would be a lower cost phone, but you're still ensuring that all of your modern iPhones look like the current iPhone X design. Now, if Apple went this route, if Apple added all of those features in an iPhone SE X design with that edge-to-edge panel, with that A12 chip, with the modern iPhone XR camera inside of it, I think we could see the price increase go up above $400, and I think that would be fair. I think we could expect Apple to price a design like this maybe closer to $500, maybe closer to $550. But with that price point, I still think it would be a really attractive phone for a lot of people all around the world. So not only do I think this would be an attractive product for people in the US, I think it would be an attractive product for people in emerging markets, especially because the cheapest iPhone you can buy that is a modern iPhone design starts at $750. I really think making an iPhone SE 10, maybe being aggressive and going for $500 and having that bigger screen, having it in that small form factor would be appealing to a lot of people. And with iPhone sales down for Apple, especially in emerging markets like India, I think having a really strong competitor there, a phone with a modern design that you're still able to price pretty cheaply. Maybe you could build this iPhone SE2 in India itself, which Apple has been doing with the iPhone SE there. And by going with a more drastic design like the iPhone 10 style, you could have a phone that is really, really competitive, not only from a design and feature standpoint, but also a price point for emerging markets. I really think Apple should bring back the iPhone SE2. I'd prefer to see it in that second style, the iPhone SE 10, but either way, I would just like to see them bring a smaller form factor iPhone with a lower cost back to market. And due to these iPhone SEs selling out almost instantly on their clearance site, I think there's definitely product demand for a smaller form factor phone. Okay, everyone, let me know what you think of the iPhone SE2. Do you think Apple should bring it back? Do you think they should go with the classic 5S design? Do you think they should go with the iPhone 6 design? Or do you like that radical iPhone SE 10 design? Also, let me know what iPhone SE features you would like to see, what kind of price point you'd like them to hit, and what kind of things you think they could do to an iPhone SE to make it a more appealing phone, especially in emerging markets. All right, everyone, if you liked the video, make sure you give it a like. If you want to see more from my channel, make sure you're subscribed. And as always, I will see you all in the next video. Take care, everyone.